Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Building a Safe Environment. My name is Paul Rosta, and I'm the Executive Editor of CPE. We've got an informative and thought-provoking program for you today, and I want to start by commending everyone in the audience for taking time out of your day to learn more about this vital topic. For property owners and managers, the number one priority is the well-being of customers, tenants, residents, staff, and visitors. But with the steady climb in active shooter incidents, more than 300 in the past 2 decades, safety can no longer be taken for granted at any location. Tragically, offices, retail centers, entertainment venues, schools, houses of worship, and other locations must all be considered potentially vulnerable. Along with their human cost, these incidents bring tremendous legal, regulatory, and financial impacts. The consequences of being unprepared are far too great to risk. Fortunately, we couldn't ask for better guides to help us navigate this challenging topic. Joining us today are 3 experts with Hub International, one of the world's leading insurance brokerage firms. Chip Stewart is National Real Estate Practice Leader and Chief Sales Officer for California. Chris Dunlap is Vice President and Risk Services Lead for Hub's real estate practice, and Isaac Monson is a Senior Consultant specializing in risk issues. Isaac has more than 15 years of risk management experience, and as a former state trooper, he brings special insight into law enforcement, emergency scene management, crowd control, investigations, and related area of expertise. Mr. Monson, thank you for your service, and gentlemen, great thanks to all 3 of you for being here today. It's good to have you with us. Before we start the presentation, let me take one more moment for a couple of housekeeping notes. This is an interactive program, and we've set aside time after the presentation for our speakers to answer your questions. Now, to ask a question, just find the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen, click the arrow, and type your question in the space provided. Just a word to the wise, you might want to send us your questions as they come to mind during the program rather than waiting until the end of the presentation. That will give our speakers a better chance to get to them in real time. They'll answer as many as they can, but if they can't get to your question, or if you prefer to reach out to them privately, Chip, Chris, and Isaac will be happy to follow up with you confidentially after the program. Also, this program is being recorded, and we'll be emailing you a link to the recording. So if you missed any part of the broadcast, or if you'd like to hear the whole thing again, not to worry. In fact, I think you'll find that the program will reward repeated listenings. And given the seriousness of the topic, I hope you'll consider sharing the link with your colleagues. Well, we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so without further delay, let's get started. Chip, welcome, and let me turn the program over to you.
Well, thanks, Paul. Just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about with all of you today. First, we're going to discuss your duty as a real estate owner to create a safe environment as a property owner and manager. Second, we'll provide some context around the workplace violence and how it relates to active shooter incidents. Third, we'll go into protection, prevention, and response measures you can take, including the 4-step prevention plan. Then we'll briefly discuss considerations to safeguard against violence, related disruptions, and finish up with Q&A. So now I'm going to pass it over to Chris Dunlap, who will speak about the duty to create a safe environment. Chris.
Thank you, Chip, and welcome to all of today's participants. To start things off, we wanted to give you a brief overview about your responsibilities from a legal and regulatory perspective regarding workplace violence and active shooter risk. First, let's talk about your responsibilities to your tenants, your residents, guests, and really anyone who uses your property. You know, when a real estate professional hears the term premises liability, the first thought is probably around slips and falls or a similar type of incident. However, the legal requirements of premises liability actually also extend to violent acts that may take place on your property. While the perpetrators of the crimes are charged criminally, they typically have very little in terms of assets compared to, a property or a large corporation. For that reason, the property owner is quite often sued with the allegation of negligence or negligent security as it relates to inadequate protection measures. The tenant of the business involved may also be sued under the same negligence precedent. We'll go over a few instances of this later on and talk about some case studies. Now let's address your responsibilities as an employer to your employees. In the U.S., there's actually no federal workplace violence regulations as of now. Therefore, OSHA's general duty clause typically would apply, which is really a catch-all that provides language that employers have to provide a safe workplace for their environment, for their employees. So if something isn't listed in the standards and something does occur, if it was an unsafe work environment, they can invoke the general duty clause. There is early talk of OSHA coming up with a standard for workplace violence across the board, but that's at least a few years away. In Canada, for those of you north of the border, each province actually dictates their own employee safety regulations, with all but one province having workplace violence prevention standards. For those who are wondering, Yukon is the only province that doesn't have a standard at this point. There's also some certain industries that have regulations or suggested best practices, so you may want to keep that in mind for if you have tenants within these industries. One example is the U.S. healthcare industry, where OSHA has put together voluntary standards around workplace violence, and CMS, which is the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, has requirements for workplace violence prevention in their emergency preparedness standards. So keep that in mind if you have clinics, doctor's offices, hospitals, assisted living type tenants. Be aware, though, these requirements would apply to your tenants as employers as well. Tenants must provide safe and work environments for their employees. We recommend that the real estate owner and manager have their own workplace violence and active shooter prevention program, share the pertinent details with tenants, and encourage the tenant to have their own program. Ideally, you want to have a program in place at the property level in conjunction with your tenant's workplace violence prevention program, and one that fills in all the gaps so you don't have any potential risks being missed. A great example is key card controls in a multi-tenanted building. The owner or manager may be the one issuing cards, taking photos, so on and so forth, but the employer has to be responsible for providing, hiring and termination information in a timely manner. Moving on, we'd like to break down the potential impacts of a violent event and explain how they can cause, wide-reaching and long-lasting damage to your business. Later, Chip's going to talk about what insurance products can be utilized to provide you with financial protection in these areas of risk. From a people standpoint, it's obvious that the impact to loss of life or serious injury is out there. But there's plenty of secondary impacts to affected coworkers, the need for grief counseling, people fearing coming to the workplace, and a general loss of morale and a sense of security at the property. From a property standpoint, it really depends upon the type of incident that occurs. Violent events with explosives or vehicles, for example, could do a lot of physical damage. Others may be very limited actual building damage. What you are going to get a lot of is business interruption and impact to the investigation, the cleanup, and all the fallout from having such a tragic event occur on your property. Business lawsuits, I touched briefly on the negligent security precedent. On the next slide, we're going to talk about a few case studies or a few examples of real live events. And then, lastly, your brand and reputation. And this is one thing that, no insurance product will cover, and it's often the hardest to come back from. So, we've had clients that are, quite frankly, their tenants are afraid to come to work due to a serious event. So, the repercussions are severe. So you want to do your best to be prepared and prevent these types of issues. So the question comes up when in order to prove negligence in a lawsuit, the event that occurs has to be foreseeable. This is a very subjective term that's really driven by juror perceptions. Another subjective term that will come into play is reasonable. Property owners are required to take reasonable violence prevention measures for any foreseeable criminal acts that could occur on their premises. Otherwise, they could be held negligent. And this is a challenge. It ultimately comes down to case law and juries' perceptions. So what's considered foreseeable? A previous credible threat, a prior violent act on the premises, or even prevailing crime statistics in the area. A great example is, if you have a multi-family asset on one area of town and there's a shooting related to gang activity, and say your neighbor owns a similar building a couple blocks down, that in a lot of cases is a foreseeable. It's foreseeable that that type of crime is occurring in your vicinity, and therefore, the proper controls really need to be in place. So the question ultimately becomes: are large-scale events foreseeable? So let's take a look at a few active shooter events and the outcomes that have happened so far. So in Virginia Tech 2007, the plaintiffs actually won their lawsuit, but then the Virginia Supreme Court later overturned it. In Aurora, Colorado, this is an example where the real estate owner and the movie theater company were both sued. In both those cases, they were found to be not guilty of negligence, as they did not at the time find it foreseeable. Las Vegas, Nevada, the litigation's ongoing. As of a few weeks ago, MGM, which is the owner of the Mandalay Bay, recently notified the SEC that it expects the settlement to be somewhere between $735 and $800 million. And that, of course, doesn't include any indirect losses such as, loss of business or attraction, to the property. And then Jacksonville, Florida, since it was more recent, the suits are still being followed, but we'll be monitoring the development and outcomes. So again, the issue is that, large-scale violent events are still statistically very unlikely. However, as they continue to occur and wide-scale media coverage puts them at the forefront, it makes these events seem more common than they actually are. So what this does is it changes the public and juror perception. So the common belief may be, instead of that this was unforeseeable, that these things have happened before and they can happen again, essentially. We do feel that the general public is gravitating towards the belief that these types of events are foreseeable. So the bottom line is that property owners need to take responsibility for protecting the properties they own and manage, and those that use the properties. So now I'll turn it over to Isaac, who's going to take us through some various types of workplace violence trends and onward.
Thanks so much, Chris. So an initial and important conversation that always kind of level sets this topic is the fact that violent crime rates in the United States have actually been trending downward and in the right direction for quite a bit of time. If you look at this graph here, this shows that violent crime in the United States peaked sometime around the early 90s and has actually been trending downward since. So with that, gun-related homicides are down as much as 50%, and crimes involving guns are actually down as much as 75%. As Chris discussed, the counter to this, next slide please, is the conversation around active shooters. So this is the elephant in the room, and oftentimes it's the starting point for property owners, management companies, businesses that are starting to have this discussion. And so as you can see here, active shooter incidents have been increasing since the year 2000, but again, they remain statistically uncommon. So although it is often the starting point for these kinds of conversations, it doesn't necessarily need to remain the focal point for your prevention strategies. Additionally, the numbers show that only 18% of reported workplace violence events even involve a weapon. So as you can see in this graph here, no weapon at all is the predominant majority of workplace violence events. Gun violence and violence involving a bladed weapon really only account for another 10% of that. And so with that as part of the conversation, it's important to think closely about the strategy that you're going to implement and why, and that it's not too preoccupied with the low likelihood active shooter type events. OSHA specifically identifies a handful of violence typologies, and it's important to cover these in a conversation about planning and prevention, because the type of property you own, the type of tenants that occupy those properties bring unique variables to your risk picture. And so we can use these typologies that OSHA outlines as kind of a baseline to best understand where our risk lies and what we're trying to prevent with a prevention plan.
So I'll run through these quickly. Type 1 is criminal intent violence, and these are all defined as the violence is related to the victim. So in criminal intent, an aggressor would typically be unknown to a company or organization, and they're looking more or less to steal things with monetary value. The example of a risk factor in this case is if your tenants have a lot of cash on hand or other valuable items, prescription narcotics, tools, construction materials, electronics. These are things that are commonly targeted in a criminal intent type of violence. And again, operating in a high crime area is another thing that can put you at greater risk. The second type, customer-client violence, is again defined by the relationship to the victim. In this circumstance, an aggressor would typically be known to the organization and they receive some kind of services from the organization. In these circumstances, they're motivated by things like perceived mistreatment or injustice or poor customer service. Examples of risk factors around this are if you're operating in an open to the public setting, things like having establishments where alcohol is served can contribute. It can put you at greater risk for that type of violence. The third type is worker versus worker. Typically, aggressor is an employee or a former employee, and these are often targeting managers or supervisors. And again, motivation around this is unresolved personal conflicts or disputes. There's a number of cultural factors that can put you at greater risk, but things like how you or your tenants are hiring, terminating employees, training managers, etc. Those are things that can put you at greater risk for that type. So the fourth type is personal relationships. This is a more traditional domestic violence type conversation. And unfortunately, domestic violence issues can bring themselves to the workplace. And they quite often do, for example, when long-term relationships are ending, if a tenant's employee or even one of your own employees or property manager people are experiencing some kind of marital transition and they're no longer accessible to an abuser at home, it's not uncommon for that abuser to find that person at work. So this is a type of violence that really transcends industry. If you employ people, you could potentially be touched by that type of violence. And so then the fifth type of violence is ideological violence. And this is a conversation that's more geared toward the high profile, social, political, extremism types of violence. Next slide, please. And the examples that we're going to look at here are recent and in the news, and you likely recognize a handful of them, but the idea here is that people are using acts of violence as political statements, and so they're typically targeting things like houses of worship or government facilities, public transportation environments, and things that generally will get a lot of media coverage, but there's typically no relationship to those organizations. Another important fact to discuss is the percentage of workplace violence incidents that result in fatality. And as Chris discussed earlier, we're typically talking about slips, trips, and falls and other types of safety issues, but violence actually does represent a relatively high percentage of fatalities in the workplace. And so as we move into conversations about protection and prevention measures, I'm going to hand this back to Chris to discuss a recent case study.
Great, thanks, Isaac. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about a true story, sad but true story that happened last year. About a year ago, one of Hub's large commercial real estate clients, about $1.5 billion in revenue, locations all around the U.S., typically multi-tenant Class A offices, suffered a tragic assault at one of its properties. A disgruntled person from the outside of the organization came onto the property, shot through the glass, entered the building, and continued shooting. He ended up killing some employees of the tenant and injuring many more. Later, it was discovered that the man was a former employee of the tenant and had left on very bad terms a few months ago. There had also been multiple threats made by the man to the tenant's organization since the termination. A restraining order had even been put in place. But as far as we know, our client had not been made aware of the situation by the tenant. Okay. So obviously, reeling from this incident, our client realized they had to take immediate actions to assist and calm the fears of the impacted tenant and all the surrounding tenants and family and such. Turning to Hub as a risk management advisor, we quickly responded by arranging grief counseling on site and following up with employee assistance support services for tenants, employees, and others in the community. The company then decided to hire armed security guards temporarily to sit outside their buildings, just really to quell the fears of a repeat incident. They did realize this was a Band-Aid, and it didn't do much to create a sense of security in their tenant base. If anything, it ratcheted up the tension. So following that, Hub developed a security assessment plan for our client, which began with a holistic evaluation of their current security practices at the corporate level and physical security assessments at each property. It also resulted in an action plan to close the gaps, support training programs, and put in place sustainable security audit processes going forward. So essentially, we looked at a few things just to give you a little bit of background about what it would entail. We focused on first the risks, looking at crime activity, local trends, things of that nature. Focused on the administrative and people aspects. These were things such as emergency response planning, specific protocols for dealing with workplace violence, threat assessment and triaging, determining which threats were credible. Looking at exit routes, alternatives, shelter-in-place areas, training of employees, review of HR policies and practices, and hiring and termination communication process between the tenant and our client, which was a major breakdown we found. And then on the physical side, we looked at more what you would expect: the locks, the lighting, vehicle control, vehicle identification, cameras, and so on and so forth. I just think it's worth noting that just hardening, quote unquote, adding protection to certain rooms does not address the key situation. Really, we want to focus on a holistic look at everything from prevention to response. So what we put together a heat map for our client to show graphical depiction of where they needed improvement and where they were strong. And so it's easy to work with them to shore up the areas that needed improvement. Unfortunately, the client made some vast improvements, but people needlessly lost their lives. The process needs to start now before a tragic event occurs. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Isaac, who's going to talk a little bit more about that.
So when you're having conversations around being proactive versus reactive, there's a neat concept that kind of comes from the military that is referred to as left of bang. And so what we're looking at on this slide is a timeline moving left to right. The violent event, which is in red, is obviously the event that you're trying to prevent and make sure it doesn't occur. And so to the left of that event on a timeline, this is the opportunities that you have to identify early warning signs. It's your opportunities to intervene or to mitigate and prevent that escalation toward violence. And a lot of times this conversation specifically gets hyper-focused on things like active shooter trainings and drills, and that really only focuses on the actual violent event and the response in that exact moment. So at Hub, what we encourage our clients to undertake is this preventative and proactive approach. We're doing most of your operating on the left of that violent event for the purposes of preventing. And of course, you still have to account for response and recovery, but it's much more efficient, much more productive, and better use of your time and resources to really build that foundation to the left of that violent event. So there's a handful of ways that you can approach creating a workplace violence prevention program. And what we're going to walk through here is just a high-level 4-step approach that really focuses on being to the left of that event on the timeline and puts a lot of time and resources toward the things that are shown to make the biggest impact in that prevention strategy. First and foremost is awareness, and just participating in this webinar is a great first step toward awareness. And the reason that awareness is so important on the front end is that if you as a property owner or manager are going to move in the direction of some prevention planning, you have to make sure that all of your stakeholders and all of your tenants are having the same conversation. Because as you know, there are a lot of variables involved in this conversation, and if some people think we're just talking physical security and others think we're just talking about active shooter drills and others think we're talking about hiring and firing employees safely, those are all parts of the conversation, but you have to have that shared awareness and understanding to plot a course toward prevention. And so once you've tackled that awareness piece with your key stakeholders, the next piece is the needs assessment. And so the needs assessment is a critical part, and I can't emphasize this enough, and for the purpose of illustration, I'm going to walk you through two separate risk assessment, needs assessment processes with two very different clients. So the first image on the left is obviously a photo of a retail environment. And so in this particular case, the property involved was an urban mixed-use facility that had some commercial and residential occupants. And so retail was on street level, residential was in the apartments above. The tenant mix on the street level comprised a large grocery, an eat-in deli, which was also serving alcohol, a small electronics store, coffee shop, and some underground parking. So a pretty typical urban kind of commercial residential mix. So when you're identifying these tenants and the different types of risk they have around violence, you would specifically call out type 1 criminal violence and then type 2 customer or client violence. Their geography specifically was urban, pretty densely populated in an area with relatively average crime rates, but some unique considerations there were that there was a very busy bus stop on the corner, lots of potential for loitering because of the bus stop, and that was something that was kind of difficult to prevent. And so another unique consideration there was that there was very fast police response times if or when needed because they were in a densely populated city area. And so that's one example of a needs or a risk assessment that clearly identifies needs around the specifics of that particular facility. The second picture to the right represents a rural multi-tenant healthcare facility. And what's different in this situation is that, for starters, the tenant mix is different. It's a standalone facility, rural, small hospital with an emergency department, pharmacy on site, extra space being leased to other healthcare providers. These types of occupants are going to be much more at risk for type 2 customer and client violence. And then because of the pharmacy being on site, there's also that risk of criminal violence. The geography is a unique consideration. It's very rural. It's on the outskirts of a small town. They're relatively low crime rates, but with that, they're also very isolated. So their unique considerations are very different than that of the urban environment with the commercial and residential occupants. And additionally, in that rural environment, there's potentially a 30-minute lag in police response times. And so we walked through those two risk and needs assessment conversations to say that as property owners, you might have two completely different facilities and two completely different geographies with very different risk factors at play, and a single one-page template from online to represent a workplace violence prevention program is really going to have a lot of gaps and inefficiencies even between relatively similar building types with different tenants and occupants. So when you've completed that first initial step and you've got your key stakeholders up to speed, they're all having the same conversations around workplace violence and general awareness, and you've taken the time and effort to put together unique needs assessments at your different facilities. Next step is really developing that prevention program. And you're going to see across all of these steps that stakeholder involvement and engaging the right people is really the first step within all of these steps. And you just can't do this independently. You have to have the right people involved. The prevention program typically is going to entail things around threat assessment and threat management, actual incident management and responses, as well as how and when you engage with law enforcement, as well as integrating that domestic violence conversation that we discussed earlier. The third step, when you've got that program identified and developed, is really to implement, which again, you're engaging the right stakeholders. This is the point at which you're clearly training and communicating with potentially your own employees, potentially tenant representatives, tenant employees, and deciding how best to move that message about your policy and your procedure across an organization and also your tenants' organizations. And then with any type of health or safety program, obviously reevaluate as needed. If your tenant base changes or the type of industry in your facilities change, then you would reassess. The fourth step, threat management and incident response, becomes critical because this is really where the rubber meets the road. So you've taken the time to bring your staff and your occupants to general awareness. You've completed the risk assessments, you've designed and implemented the program, and that's the point at which you potentially now are having threats and potential threats and incidents reported to either you as a property owner or your tenants are having reports brought to them. And that's the point at which you have to be able to assess and manage. Next slide, please. Some special considerations for building owners and building managers. A strong reporting culture is critical. When you've gone to the time and efforts to put these kind of programs in place, really the eyes and ears on the ground are tenants, customers and clients, the tenants' employees, and potentially property managers. And encouraging reporting around these issues is going to be critical in being able to assess and manage any kind of threats of violence that may exist. And so that second bullet there, threat assessment and threat management, it sounds very tactical and very jargony, but really all it means is if and when you are made aware that there's a threat, you're going to have to decide how credible is this threat. And the best way to do that is with a structured judgment tool. And there's a lot of different vendors that can support you in that. But the idea is that you're not weighing it every time, and your assessment process is more formal than just saying, well, yeah, that guy's crazy. Of course he would act violently, right? That's not very objective, and it doesn't give you anything really actionable. So once you've assessed a threat and it's been reported, then the question is, well, how do we manage this? And as we talked about, active shooter scenarios are highly unlikely statistically. What's very likely is that a threat of violence disrupts your operation. And this could be something as simple as a tenant terminates an employee, that employee goes home, goes online and starts making threats across social media. And it could be something as simple as I'm going to come back and punch my manager in the nose, or as complex as I'm going to come back and get even with you. And those are threats. They're documented because they're on social media, so you have evidence that they occurred, but then you have to assess the seriousness and the credibility, likely outcomes, and then decide how you manage it. Are we bringing in additional vendors to participate in security? Are we going to monitor social media activity? Are we going to engage police to go to this person's house to try and engage and determine the legitimacy of the threat? So those are all steps that are really where the rubber meets the road. And if you have a program in place, that's the actionable thing that you have to be able to do as a property owner. And you want to be able to collaborate with your tenants. Third photo here is about emergency notification and tools. Really one of the biggest gaps that I see when you're having conversations with clients about workplace violence prevention and response is big gaps in how they communicate. And this is specifically relevant for property owners who have multiple tenants and possibly multiple types of industries within their buildings, because how do you bridge the gaps between those groups if one of your tenants is dealing with a threat of violence, but none of the others are aware that this threat has occurred, they're really not able to plan or strategize about how to keep their own employees or customers or clients safe. So emergency notification across platforms is critical, and as the property owner or manager, you have a unique umbrella to use that can kind of encompass all of the different tenants. Next slide, please. Special considerations beyond the three that we just discussed. As a owner, it's critical that you encourage and facilitate tenant participation. If you're going to do this and you do it on your own and your tenants are not engaged or participating, it's really going to be difficult to have an effective management of any types of threats that arise. Offering workplace violence seminars or templates to your tenants is a good way to help get the conversation started. It's also a good way to encourage communication across those different venues or those different industries. Additionally, you want to layer your own plan over the top so that you're dealing with collaborative approaches as opposed to everyone having separate and different strategies. And then, of course, physical security considerations. Chris touched on this a bit earlier, but the conversation there comes to a more traditional security conversation around crime prevention through design, access controls, visitor management tools, and things like security monitoring, security guards. So these are all going to be part of your bigger and broader prevention program. They all work kind of in an integrated approach, and it's really critical to make sure that you have all the right people participating. So from here, I'm going to hand this back to Chip, and Chip's going to start walking us through some coverage considerations around the insurance piece.
Thanks for doing that. And, it's been something that, you just don't think it's going to happen to you, but these types of events just keep happening. So what we thought we'd do is, from an insurance standpoint, how does this affect your insurance? And there's really, three different food groups that active shooter or work violence affects. The first is the employees. So workers' compensation is different in different states, different provinces. But in most cases, workers' compensation is the first line of defense for repairing the damages to your employees. In other words, taking care of their medical needs. The general liability side is protecting you, your real estate assets from any type of liabilities or negligence that happens in relation to owning the premises. And that's very important here, and I'll explain why in a moment. And then third, this is the part that everybody always thinks about is, okay, what about the damage to my building? Property policies. And there's two different types that you should think about. There's a named peril policy, which is very common, sold widely. And then there's the better type of policy, which is called all risk. And the all risk policy basically puts the burden back on the insurance company to say, no, that is not covered, it's excluded. And there's 10 or 15 exclusions that you look to. Whereas the more common policy on the property policy is named perils, and the burden of proof is on you to find the peril that the active shooter or the workplace violence started the trigger of the policy. An easy one is fire. It's very easy to say, okay, yes, there was a fire. But in a lot of times, and I know this is difficult, but there's shootings, broken glass, broken doors, there's use of law enforcement, sprays and so forth. Where does that all covered? It's not windstorm, it's not hail, it's not riots. There may be some smoke damage, but most people are hanging their hats on the word vandalism that's found in their named peril policies. So look at your homework, go check and make sure that you've got either an all risk or if you have named perils that you've been included with vandalism. Let's go to the next slide. So let's drop into the coverages a little bit on the property side. That is the first party property that you own. And you need to identify what the triggers are in your policy. And if it is named perils, there are about 10 or 11 of them. If they're all risk, then there's probably 10 or 11 exclusions that the insurance company has to go for. So usually things like broken glass, damage to doors, damage to buildings, and so forth are all covered. But then the next thing that you think about is, well, what about the loss of revenue? What about the loss of rents while people are out? In other words, this could be a day, this could be a week, this could be a month. It could be detrimental to your P&L. So business interruption insurance is always triggered by the property policy. You don't buy it as a sidecar, you buy it part of the property policy, and there is a trigger. So what happens if it's the location next door or down the street? And I've been closed down. There's been police cars out in front of my shopping mall or my apartment building or warehouse for a week. I've been shut down. What about business interruption? What about loss of rents? The one thing that I can ask you to do on your homework assignment here today is to look at the ingress-egress clause of your property policy. A lot of times that acts as a side trigger to a business interruption. General liability, well, if you haven't listened to the seminar today, you're going to need it. General liability really will cover that 10% of the instances that have weapons, the OSHA number 5 event that we talked about, which is absolutely the worst. But general liability protects the property owner, the landowner, from negligence for bodily injury and property damage to third parties, not to your own. And then the excess liability follows that general liability policy. If you don't have plans, if you don't have any preparedness, you take a look at your directors and officers and liability policies, because you may get a lawsuit from tenants, from even co-owners. It can come from anybody, but D&O will protect you for bad decisions. And that's what they'll come at you with, is that you made a bad decision. You didn't protect your tenants. You didn't protect your employees properly. You own the company. You own the real estate. Do you have directors and officers liability? Workers' compensation, again, is statutory in some states. You really need to know what the laws are. And if you are in a statutory state, I'll just throw out California, and you aren't buying workers' compensation and you have an incident, it gets real bad for you. You do want workers' compensation. Terrorism after 9/11, it was, everybody was talking about it. And I will tell you, by now, in 2019, it's gotten pretty quiet. It's just a little endorsement in your policy that you check or don't check to purchase it, and it's not very expensive. But if you had one of these events and it was deemed a terrorist act, in other words, a category OSHA number 5, somebody from a foreign national country coming in and devastating your property, terrorism would apply. So you might want to check and see if you've checked the box for terrorism or if you haven't. And lastly, this gets a little tough. We've actually had experience here at Hub with this, but after the fact, it is a crime scene, and I'm talking about environmental and pollution liability now. It's a crime scene, and you don't have control over until the authorities tell you you do. And they tend to leave things like bodies around inside for a day or two while they do investigation or longer. And what's happened, and we've found, is that the insurance companies aren't quite sure what to do with that, because of leaving the crime scene the way it was for days or hours, you get bad things that happen inside, whether the ceiling tiles, the carpet, the curtains, what have you. Everything has this very bad odor in it, and you can't use the room, and it needs to be cleaned. And some of the insurance companies are now saying, well, sorry, but that's an environmental or pollution issue. It's not covered under your property policy or general liabilities policy. So another piece of homework, check to see if you've got a sublimit for environmental liability. If you have a big property with a lot of people coming and going, you might want to check into environmental liability. So let's move to the next slide, and Chris is going to tell you a few more things about how to build a safe environment.
Thanks, Chip. Yeah, so just to sort of sum up and outline everything that we've covered, you as property owners and managers have the responsibility to protect, your properties, your guests, your tenants, your employees as well. Unfortunately, what we see usually is businesses get serious about security and violence prevention after something happens. Isaac did a great job of laying out the timeline of being proactive versus reactive. And our goal is to operate at the quote unquote left of bang. So what can we do to prevent and identify these threats and mitigate them going forward? And then, of course, that's part and parcel to having, robust response measures and emergency action plans. But I guess the big takeaway is don't wait. Get started today, work with, reach out to Hub or your broker, whomever, and get serious about security and look at your risk. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. As Isaac highlighted, with every type of property and location comes a very unique set of risks. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chip to talk a little bit more about the resources we can offer.
Yeah, so this is a screen that you may want to screenshot just now, but in addition to what we've talked about, these are several resources that you can access right now. You can read more relative to this topic under the Insights section of hubinternational.com, and there are things such as 4 steps to tenant communication during a crisis, and then understand your liability for an active shooter incident. So those are all there for you right now if you'd like. There's also an active shooter resource center available to you and your tenants under the risk services section of our website. We also have a number of insights and resources for the real estate industry at hubrealestate.com, hubrealestate.com. So now let's go back to Paul Rosa, who's going to moderate some question and answers in the moments that we have left. I know we have some questions.
This is Isaac.
Let's see if any questions.
This is Isaac. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just address a frequently asked question that I get quite often, and that is we already have a written policy that says we have zero tolerance for violence. And oftentimes people acknowledge that that's not quite enough to get to where they want to be. And while having that written policy in place is a great starting point, it really doesn't fully address all of the issues that we discussed here as a group over the last hour. And so although that is a really good first step, it is certainly not the only step. Has Paul rejoined?
He has not. So if you are having more questions, you can reach us.
Oh, hi there. Sorry, gentlemen. I think I might have had a little technical difficulty on my end, but I'm back live and in person. Sorry about that. We missed you. But so please go ahead.
You were going to take questions.
Yes, and I have one here that I'd like to bring up for either. I think this might be a good one for Chris or Isaac. What about responding to an active shooter, such as what would you recommend for a strategy you usually think of? Run, hide, fight, just to survive that situation. So what would you say to that?
That's a great question. So as we kind of discussed, we steered away from the direct questions and planning around the actual emergency response. Department of Homeland Security and most others point toward an individualized response strategy in those events because it's so difficult to orchestrate kind of a strategic response, because when you've reached that point and you're now deciding, should I run, hide, or fight, that's a very localized and personal decision that individuals have to make. So the best response and training around that is really to help your tenants and your own staff and yourself to be aware that those are your options, and they're not great, but they are general in nature because you have to be dynamic in that situation. And there's really not a prescribed option, like with a fire drill, for example. People are very accustomed to hearing a fire alarm, acknowledging that it's a drill, very quietly and orderly lining up, exiting a facility, and going to the parking lot to their rally point. Something we're all very familiar with in both schools and other types of businesses. The run, hide, fight thing is relevant because it's a very different kind of emergency that requires a very different kind of response. And so unfortunately, it really falls on the individual to decide what kind of threat they're against in their very specific time and space, as opposed to a big orchestrated fire evacuation, for example.
All right. Well, thank you for that response, Isaac, since that's a very clearly, as you said, a frequently asked question in these circumstances. And here's our next question. How do you recommend notifying all tenants of a workplace during a violent incident? And the second part of that is also, does that have any insurance implications?
So I can take the first part about notification. In the past, especially in healthcare, we've heard of facilities, companies using code words. I would just hesitate and issue caution there. The issue that becomes with code words is visitors and those not familiar with your protocols, people on their first day, what have you, guests, patients, whomever, aren't going to be aware of what that incident truly means. Paging Dr. Black is only usable for a few folks. So that being said, we feel you want to be clear and concise. And to Isaac's point earlier, really having robust communication systems and even fail-safe. So, if you have a mass notification text system, what's your backup plan if there's a disruption there? And then as far as communicating with tenants, really just providing them with factual information, attempting to keep everyone informed while not creating a panic, and being as clear as possible. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I would add to that. From a tools and technology standpoint, there are a lot of tools that exist, and I won't say any by name, not specifically endorsing any, but it's multi-channel mass communication tools. And if any of the participants have kids in school or themselves have attended college or university recently, you probably get signed up for one of these systems, and they can be used to send email, text message, robocalls, all simultaneously in the event of some kind of emergency that needs to be communicated across all platforms. And the text message you get that says school is canceled today because of weather is the same platform that property owners can use to communicate with both tenants, but the employees of tenants or your own staff in a way that's both timely and succinct. And those are tools that exist so you can pre-plan for the basic communications and become more specific as needed. But an example of why that's important is if you have 2 shifts or 3 shifts and something happens at the end of a first shift and your second shift people aren't there, if they're not in the building and they haven't received any communication, you might have a whole new wave of people unknowingly coming to an emergency scene. And so those are tools that have a pretty broad reach, and they're also third-party vendors. So the technology is such that it's pretty user-friendly in most circumstances and can be pretty effective in sending that broad message as needed.
All right, let's go to our next question here. How would you recommend handling first responders' access to secure tenant suites?
Great question. So I can tell you firsthand from being in law enforcement for quite a long time that there's nothing more frustrating than responding to an emergency scene and then not being able to access said emergency scene, specifically with like medical type events. And really the best advice I can offer on that front is to have a designated liaison. And again, it goes back to pre-planning. The better and more familiar your relationship is with local law enforcement, even if it's as localized as if you're in a big city, who are the officers on patrol in your specific precinct, or who are the lieutenants, or similar with fire and medical. If you can have a pre-existing relationship with some people in a liaison capacity that allows them familiarity with your facility, the easiest ways to access, and then asking your tenants to have similar relationships with those people really can streamline some of that stuff from a fire department perspective. The Knox box or the universal access options exist, but on the violence conversation or the police conversation, it's very specific and localized. But the more pre-planning you can do and the more relationship building you can do, the better off you're going to be.
Great, thank you. And here's our next question, which I think I'm going to direct toward Chip, if you'd like to take it. And it's about environmental coverage. And the listener wants to know, is environmental coverage usually a part of the general liability policy, or would that be included in the property policy, or perhaps in some other kind of coverage?
So the answer is both. You can buy it on the general liability policy, which means that you are causing environmental damage to a third party like your neighbor. But in this particular scenario we're talking today, most people are most interested in the environmental part where they had an active shooter and they have a real mess on their hands, and it's going to be a crime scene for a while, and that's where you want to see if you have like a $10,000, $50,000 sublimit in your policy. So it's a little homework for everybody. The other question I see on the screen here is about gray areas in coverage, and this is one of them because it's new, and most underwriters have not considered that environmental is part of an active shooter until they get to the claim itself. So a lot of gray areas, and that's really up to your broker to help you become insured. They have to be your advocate in these cases. And then there's a lot of different pieces of coverage as far as general liability, D&O, workers' compensation, and even sometimes health insurance. A lot of gray areas, a lot of moving pieces. It's good to have one advocate looking over all of them.
Okay, great. And this one, well, I'm going to toss this one out to the panel here and see which of you would like to take it on. We hired a third-party security company. Does the risk fall on them?
Well, I can tell you from an insurance standpoint, that we see lawsuits all the time where they sue the owner of the building and the third-party vendor. And so hopefully you have a contract with the third-party vendor, the security company, and it says that they are the primary insurance and that you've received a certificate of insurance and you are named as an additional insured. So that's kind of how you get on their policy. Absence of them having a policy, maybe they let it lapse or you didn't get your certificate on time, then as long as it's negligence for property damage, third party, or bodily injury, the real estate owner's general liability policy will step in. But the key to this all is if the third party vendor is sued and you're sued, can you make sure that you are an additional insured on their policy? And that way it keeps it off of yours.
Well, I think we have time maybe for just one or two more questions real quick. And I'd like to bring one up that I think I'd like to hear each of you maybe address each in his own way. As you look around at the world of real estate owners and property managers, are there some particular areas that you see that you could say, just if you were to make a sort of a broad brush kind of comment, where you see a particular opportunity for improvement, whether it's because of a significant gap on the coverage side, on the emergency preparation and training side? Are there any areas where you see the most need, the most opportunity for improved procedures. Let's see, Chip, any thoughts on that in the realm of coverage itself?
Well, sure. Depending on, do you think you are a target for violence, workplace violence? Do you think you're a target for active shooters? It's hard to say. There are some gaps. There are some gray areas in all the insurance portfolios. Insurance companies are starting to react to it. But I will tell you that you can actually buy now active shooter insurance, mostly through London, and you can talk to your broker about that. It's a new product that's unfortunately had to come out in recent months.
Okay, and Isaac, in your presentation, you mentioned concerns about emergency notification networks, and what about that? Would that be your number one area that you think that would be that you think could stand the most improvement? Is there any other sort of part of a comprehensive strategy that you think could that would be, whether it's low-hanging fruit or just what really should be a priority?
Yeah, so I think there's good opportunity to drive conversations around kind of a holistic approach, because there can tend to be an overemphasis on physical security spending as kind of a buffer, and the unfortunate reality is a lot of these events are inside people. So if you're, protecting against a mythological outside intruder that's going to come and, act violently, when your actual risk is that you have a toxic work culture that's not being addressed, and you're fostering hostilities within your workforce, or your tenants are, then you're really missing opportunities to lean on those soft skills and policy and training and hiring and terminating practices that really can move the needle and help prevent these types of things from occurring. Whereas overemphasizing, overspending on physical security can often leave people frustrated and saying, like, there was nothing's changed. We have all this security in place now and visitor management systems, but we don't feel any safer today than we did previously.
Well, clearly, safety is an issue that we could talk about all day long, but unfortunately, we are just about out of time for today's program. But let me thank Chip Stewart, Chris Dunlap, and Isaac Munson of Hub International for being our guides through this very important topic today. I really appreciate your time. And I would like to remind everyone in our audience that you will receive a link to the recording of today's program. And if you found this webinar to be informative, please tell a colleague and pass along the link to the recording. I don't need to tell you that this is a very important topic. Thank you so much for listening to today's MHN webinar, and have a great day.